Welcome, everybody. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And we are very thankful for you taking the time today to join our ESN conversation. This is a special treat for anybody who's a lover of the work of C.S. Lewis. So many of us have been shaped by his books, but who shaped the mind of C.S. Lewis? My colleague at the Emerging Scholars Network, Hannah Eagleson, has a PhD in early modern literature from the University of Delaware and an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College. And we thought she'd be the perfect interviewer for our guest today, Jason Baxter, whose new book, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, was recently published with InterVarsity Press. I'm just going to take a moment to share a few things to orient us to our time together. One is I do want to let you know that we are recording today's conversation. If you would prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please keep your mic muted and disable your video and or audio. By continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. I'm going to pause our recording now to allow you to disable your video if you'd prefer not to be recorded. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, who will introduce our guest.
I'm Hannah Eagleson, as Bob said, and I'm delighted you can all join us today. And we're thrilled to have Jason Baxter with us. So Jason will start teaching at Notre Dame in the fall, and previously was a professor at Wyoming Catholic College. He has scholarly publications on the Platonic tradition and on Dante. And he has also written popular introductions to Dante and to Christian mysticism. So definitely look for those as well. And today we're talking to him about his latest book, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. So Jason, I'm just really delighted you could join us today. And there are so many things that I want to ask you about based on this book, from Platonism to close readings of moments in Dante and Lewis. We're probably not going to get to all of them without a graduate seminar. So we'll focus on giving participants a brief taste or glimpse of your work so that they'll want more. And in a way, we hope this is a little bit like those brief stabs of joy that Lewis writes so eloquently about in his autobiography, which lead him on to something fuller and richer in time. So I will try to use examples from a variety of different works by Lewis. So hopefully you'll see one of your favorites, whichever it is. But for participants, please also try and include your own interests in the questions you ask in the chat, and that will help us explore some of the ones I don't get to. So Jason, to start, a relatively easy question, I hope. You described Dante as probably the most influential medieval author for Lewis. And as someone who did a PhD in Renaissance literature, I heartily endorse everybody reading the Divine Comedy. At the same time, for some fans of Lewis who are just coming to his medieval sources, they might want a more doable starting point than a 3-volume epic poem. What medieval book might be a good doable starting point for someone just starting to explore this?
Yeah, no, I was telling Hannah before that her easy questions are, real brain stimulators for the middle of June, but maybe this is a good one to get going with. I think, I think Dante's comedy is divided into 3 big books, right? The one through Hell or Inferno, the one through Purgatory, and then the one through Paradiso. Paradiso is difficult, so difficult that Slate a couple years ago had an article which ran, "Does anyone read Dante's Paradiso?" And the Inferno, I think, is, sort of what you get in high school, or just a sort of, literary survey. But I think it's kind of off-putting for some. Just it's this kind of, Hieronymus Bosch-esque gruesome vision of the, of the underworld. And then this sometimes, I think, surprises some of my Protestant readers and viewers. But believe it or not, I think Dante's Purgatorio or Dante's Purgatory, I would say, might be the best place, to begin. Because it's the most human, it's the most sort of concerned with with hope. It's the most sort of concerned with what we could call sanctification. It's most concerned with what I call the process of getting head knowledge to become heart knowledge, with the sort of process of not just sort of, espousing correct opinions or the right creed, but actually sort of getting into the marrow of your bones. Purgatorio is, I think, brilliant for that. It's about rebuilding divisive, fragmented human communities. It's about actually becoming the sort of person in the deep level that you think that you are in the head level. So maybe Dante's Purgatory. Augustine's Confessions, I think, is a great one to begin with. The first couple of chapters, just in which he tells his own story, I think is just incredibly relatable. And then he describes his own kind of mystical experience, which he has with his mother in Ostia, just outside of Rome. And then he has some kind of heavy duty meditations and reflections on time and eternity in books 9 and 10. That might be an interesting place to go. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy is divided up into 5 little books. And each one of those little books, I would suspect, would take about an hour to read. Books 4 and 5 get really difficult. 1, 2, and 3, I think, are pretty accessible and encouraging. All about the question of, I guess that one of these sort of eternal human questions: why do bad things happen to good people? And Boethius takes a great sort of stab at that, writing a book which is not just sort of theological and theoretical, but also meant to be a kind of practical consolation, as the title would suggest. 4 and 5 get difficult, but if our listeners and watchers are fans of Tolkien, then if you read very closely books 4 and 5, then you'll realize how much Tolkien, quote unquote, plagiarized from Boethius, especially when he talks about time and eternity and providence and fate. Tolkien knew it through the Old English translation of the Latin text, and so Tolkien sort of got it through that. But it's very kind of, I think it'll resonate very much as a sort of for readers of the Inklings. And then maybe the most fun, easy, accessible place, maybe not technically a medieval author, but the lyric poet George Herbert. The 17th century lyric poet George Herbert wrote his book, The Temple, was published posthumously. I think it's the most sincere, devout thing I know of. Each one of the poems feels like, I don't know, like a burning coin, right? If picking it up off a sort of a hot cookie tray or something like that. It's just, they're sort of instantly memorable, these things that kind of, impress themselves on your mind. So there you go. There's some options for your listeners.
Those all sound like wonderful starting points, Jason. And I actually wrote my dissertation on George Herbert and John Donne, so I'll never argue with that. That sounds wonderful.
Good.
We might need to do a bit of troubleshooting before we go on to the next question. It seems like there's a high-pitched sound, a bit almost like a modem in the background. It went away a couple of times while you were speaking and then came back, and I'm wondering if it's an issue with how far away or close you are to the mic. Now it's gone. Oh, it just started up again.
Okay.
If you want to try just saying a few sentences about maybe your own favorite medieval author or something very easy, I'll give you a thumbs up when it's going away and take it down when it's coming.
Move away from the microphone and hope that helps in some capacity. Yeah.
That sounds good where you're at right now.
All right.
I'll let you know in the private chat if it comes back. So,
well, come on, I'm a medievalist. I should have known to keep my distance from technology, right? Yeah.
I guess that's one of the lessons here.
Yeah.
Thanks for adjusting that. And yeah, I'll let you know through the chat if it comes back. So moving from the doable to the vast, you explore the medieval concept of the cosmos extensively in the book. I know this is a bit of a travesty to ask for the 5-minute description of the medieval concept of the cosmos, but could you give us that and then maybe a few ways that concept influenced the world building of Narnia and the space trilogy?
Yes, I think you're right. This is the vast question, isn't it? I think, but I think also probably the most important question to address. I think you could put it like this: for us in modernity, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here in terms of the sound issue. Yeah, I guess I could try to switch microphones and see if that fixes it.
Yeah, maybe give that a shot. And while you're making that switch, you can just give me a thumbs up when you think you've got that.
Okay, I'll just switch over to my computer's speakers, and hopefully that'll work.
Great, it's sounding good.
Good. Yeah, so I think the incredible difference is that for us, scholars say that we live in the age of a mechanized universe. That is, surprise, surprise, in the 17th century, as scientists began to use tools and machines to measure and quantify the universe, the world felt and looked more and more like a machine, right? In some sense, the objects with which we used to measure it begin to influence how we actually perceived it. And so we live in a mechanistic universe, which means we think that the meaning resides within my mind and my heart, and out there, just sort of lumps of matter, inert lumps of matter, waiting for an engineer to come along and reassemble, disassemble, and then rebuild my body, my surroundings, my landscapes to whatever it was I desire. But philosophers of science say that for us, there's no meaning outside of human intentions. There's no value, so to speak, in the material world. Well, for the medieval world, it was the exact opposite. The very sort of natural structure of the world was what we could say iconic. Boethius uses this extraordinary phrase in which he says, time imitates eternity. Time is an imitation of eternity, by which he means something like what I think Lewis means by his term transposition. I think if I would add that to the chat as my second favorite Lewis work, number one being Weight of Glory, but number two being transposition, right? In that sermon, as people will remember, Lewis says, imagine an age before electronic recordings of music. If you went to a symphony, like say a big Gustav Mahler symphony, right? And you hear his 400 instruments and his long sort of complicated music, and then you went home and immediately ordered the score from it. You and a talented friend could sit down at a piano and play it as a sort of transposition for four hands. And when you played different sort of parts, you would remember, oh yes, that's the cello part or the flute part or the violin part or whatever, right? But in some sense, the piano music would be a reduction, a symbol, an icon, a lower level language trying to express the higher level language of the symphonic arrangement itself. Okay, well, with that in mind, this is how I think, we can think about the understanding the medieval cosmos, in which I sort of sometimes say that for the medieval mind, physics was a subset of theology. That is, the very physical operations of the world, the very way in which time worked and which space worked, was an effort to try to express, to the extent it could, something of a spiritual reality, the higher level language to which it was constantly pointing to. Now, this might sound a little abstract, but it has kind of, huge implications. It means that unlike for us, I remember sort of, maybe some of our listeners will remember Carl Sagan and the sort of popularization of science, right? Of, in the 80s, 70s and 80s, in which it was the sort of image of mankind being lost in this infinite ocean of space. And we looked out at these things and wondered if there were anything else out there. It's a very modern experience. For the medieval mind, for the medieval world is in some sense has a kind of upward spiritual gravity. It has a kind of pull. You look at it, and in the medieval world, beauty makes sense. In the medieval world, there's a kind of inspiring spiritual pull built even into the natural system. So as I put it in the book, the medieval world, the very physical structure itself, the very cosmos, felt like a cathedral, felt like a Gothic cathedral. And I'm thinking of some of these old world cathedrals with which some of your listeners have seen either in, Salisbury or, Chartres in France, or Notre Dame de Paris before it burned in Paris. But I think our medieval ancestors would have maybe suggested the other way around. They wouldn't have said that the world feels like a cathedral, but rather the cathedral feels like the world.
that it was a kind of almost kind of like a scientific instrument to get the deep structures of the world to reveal themselves. Here's how I put it in the book. Standing in a medieval cathedral gives you a kind of X-ray vision of the world. Meaning is everywhere, full and rich. The material world has been gathered to a saturation point. In a cathedral, the spiritual world feels like it's leaking in, and our response to it is to want to soar up and through and out. Simply look up any of the black and white photographs of Salisbury Cathedral, and you'll see what I mean. So I think, just to sort of gesture at Lewis here, you remember all those times in Weight of Glory? There's this funny passage in the middle of it in which he says, I bet you think I'm trying to weave an enchantment. He says, we come sometimes to moments in which we talk about things which are so intimate that we become embarrassed and we begin to laugh at ourselves as if we're trying to pry open some sort of inner secret. What he calls in the hideous strength that Merlin experiences, the eternal ache or the aching wound, right? For some reason in modernity, and this is what Surprised by Joy is all about, isn't it? But for some strange reason in modernity, those kinds of uplifting moments, those sort of beauty moments, those saturation moments feel strange and out of place. Because in a valueless world of facts and mechanisms and engineering, that kind of sense of beauty seems peripheral to what's actually there. In the Middle Ages, though, in the medieval mind, that sense of beauty is at the center of reality. It's iconic, so that the right response to the world, now think of Abolition of Man, right? In which Lewis says, do you see what's happened in modern education? We just go about facts, whereas our ancestors wanted to train just sentiments. That's the consequences of what's been lacked. They're pedagogical consequences, but also in our world, beauty seems kind of a peripheral experience. That's a quick stab at it, as well as maybe the more important question of why it actually matters.
Well, as long as I'm asking you to briefly describe the indescribable, I really appreciated the way that you engaged with the idea of the numinous, and I think that connects to some of what you're saying about the cosmos as well. So you say that that concept of the numinous is absolutely everywhere in Lewis's writing. So what is the numinous, and why is it so important in works like Till We Have Faces?
Yes, I love this word. Is a coinage by the early 20th century Lutheran theologian Rudolf Otto, who was convinced that in the modern world, we had lost a concept of what holiness actually means and what holiness actually feels like. For us, holiness, when we're at our worst, tends to become a word which is synonymous with other bland adjectives like kind and nice, right? Oh, he's very holy, right? He's a very nice person, right? Won't say anything particularly offensive, right? But Otto thought, look, I mean, if you read the Old Testament, you read sort of, an encounter of, say, Jacob and the angel wrestling with the angel, and the angel wounds him, right? Once he's asked for a blessing. Or you read the beginning of Ezekiel and this crazy out of this world experience that Ezekiel has, or Isaiah 6, as well as even the sort of pagan literature, right, which talks about encounters with gods and divinity, then you realize that we've missed something. And so he comes up with this concept of the numinous to mean, or to suggest what he calls that overplus of meaning, which goes beyond the merely good or the merely bad. It's not just sort of manners or courtesy or sort of right behavior, but it's a kind of property, I guess you could call it a kind of spiritual radioactivity, in which we suspect we would tremble. Or, I mean, just to continue with how distant this concept, just think of, right, the only time we use the word awesome, it's if we're, skateboarding, right? Well, that's an awesome trick, right? Or the only time we use the word awful is with a plumbing problem when water starts leaking through your ceiling, right? And this is awful. But those words in terms of awesome and awful were used by our ancestors to also describe spiritual qualities of this this numinous property. That is holiness, having almost a kind of tangible, visceral quality impressing itself, and a corresponding fear and trembling in the human creature who encounters it. because we come to recognize we're in the presence of a being which is on a complete another level from us. That's what I don't know if this is beginning to sound familiar to our listeners, right? But that's what Otto means by the Numinous. Now, Lewis, we know, read, Rudolf Otto. It's one of his favorite books. He writes about it in his Christian Century letter as one of the books that influenced his sense of vocation the most. He writes about it to friends in his letters. But I think this sense of kind of restoring the holiness of God, restoring the awesomeness and the awfulness, and even a word that our ancestors used to sometimes to describe the divine majesty, terrible, right? Terribilis. This sort of sense of awe, it's in Out of the Silent Planet, if you remember that, right? I've just recently re-listened to it for fun. And when Ransom goes there and he starts to meet the Uyarsis, there are all kinds of Rudolf Otto moments in that sort of description as this mere man who, being a modern individual, having thought that mankind has achieved this incredible sort of pinnacle of evolution and invented so many machines that we can control our own destiny, now is drawn into the presence of creatures who are on a different ontological level, a higher level of being than he is. And in some sense, part of Ransom's education is almost kind of going back to what we would probably too often call primitive times of humanity, in which although they might have had less capacity to do engineering and known fewer elements of the periodic table, had a greater sort of sense of the numinous in these kinds of spiritual qualities. So in some sense, Ransom's evolutionary process is really a circular one. He has to go all the way back to the archaic age, and he becomes this kind of, infantile pupil, right? All over again, even though he comes from the world's most advanced, scientific, sophisticated civilization. But also remember how Lewis puts it in something that you would know very well, Hannah, his book on English literature in the 16th century. His introductory title to that, or his title to the introduction is called New Learning and New Ignorance. That in some sense, our quantifiable knowledge, our mechanistic knowledge, our knowledge about how things function, our efficient cause knowledge has come at the price at these other forms of say, spiritual intuition, or the ability to recognize things such as the numinous. So that's at least one place where it shows up in Lewis's fictional writing. Yeah, the Out of the Silent Planet, but elsewhere too.
Oh, that's a really interesting segue to another question I have related to the numinous, which is, you very eloquently describe how Lewis points to Dante as an example of the numinous and how medieval mystical authors are also engaging with the numinous. And yet the word itself is coined by this 20th century theologian, Rudolf Otto. And that kind of makes me think about the overall project of intellectual and literary history, about tracing an idea or an image through various texts over time. This is obviously a project that's important to Lewis in a number of his works, and seems as though it's an important part of your own work as a professor and writer too. Mm-hmm. Now, in a moment, we'll have to swap to audience Q&A. So those of you in the audience, do start putting some questions in the chat there. So we have some to choose from. But I guess I wanted to ask you, what do we get from intellectual and literary history that we might not get just from a direct encounter with one of the books along the way? Or in other words, what do we get by reading Plato, Boethius, Dante, and Lewis, rather than just one of them in isolation?
Hannah, it was when I read this question in your email that I realized I was in the big leagues. I thought, wow, Hannah don't play. This is legit. I think why do you sort of trace these themes out diachronically, right, through history and see how they emerge in conversation? I think there are lots of interesting ways to answer that, but at least one is this: I've just moved from Wyoming, and Wyoming is one of these kind of incredible kind of geological states. Right. Obviously, there's Yellowstone, but also where I was living in the center of the state in Lander, all kinds of weird things happen in Wyoming because there's lots of heat and there's lots of pressure, and then water under pressure and heat creates all kinds of problems for landscapes, including sometimes it carves paths and goes underground in Wyoming, and a whole river will just disappear into a sink. And then will show up, a half mile later and reemerge, having traced its way through these, subterranean caverns. I think at least sort of following our history and reading our ancestors. Remember, Lewis said that you should read one old book for every modern one that you read. This isn't a very good marketing strategy for IVP, right? For one book out of print for every one book you do read from IVP. No, but Lewis said you had to have that kind of balance. And I think this is why, is if you can find in some sense one of those kind of subterranean rivers in which some theme accidentally reemerges in authors who are separated by centuries, analogous to my Wyoming river separated by miles, then I think you're beginning to sort of put your finger on something which is endemically human, right? Something which can't go away. And I sometimes put it this way to my students, is that, look, we live in a trending culture, don't we? In which, and this could be a good thing as well, but in which the world sort of gains a consciousness of a injustice or some sort of virtue that we've overlooked for a while, or some sort of vice that we've tolerated for too long, and our attention is sort of focused on that thing. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we're only in some sense allowed to focus on one moral virtue per year, first of all, I'm not entirely sure that if it's a deep problem, we'll knock it out within a year, right? And secondly, my belief is that the moral life is probably more complicated, right? It's more, if I can use a medieval term for music, more polyphonic, right? Think Thomas Tallis or Palestrina and these sort of complicated layering of melodic sounds, right? What if the moral life is like that? It's more like a Bach fugue than right? In which case, we really need to remember, I'm just going to throw out a funny number, 29 moral virtues simultaneously, and practicing all of those to a certain extent. Now, I think that in some sense, human history is always getting better and it's always getting worse. And so that when we point out that, like, oh man, 50 years ago, that's when people really were both right and wrong. Because of course, 50 years ago, they would have pointed 50 years ago and, think Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, right? Where he thinks he's found the golden age of Paris in 1920s and gets magically transported back. And they all say, oh, to have been in the day of Renoir in the 1860s. But then you go back there and they say, oh, to have been in the Renaissance of the 1560s, right? I think to a certain extent that's true. But why it's true is because being human is complicated and involves these sort of multiple strands of sort of virtuous inclinations, as well as sort of vices which keep sneaking back. So I think to read these authors as a conversation from Plato to Lewis helps us, one, make sure that we don't have any accidental blind spots in our own moral life, right? If we're so concerned with the three, arguably legitimate virtues and values that our world wants us to focus on, that we forget that there are 24 others that our ancestors really knew quite well, maybe even to some extent capable of teaching us. I think that's at least one of the values of taking this, avoiding what Lewis called chronological snobbery, right? Thinking that just because we happen to be alive, we've reached some sort of superior state of evolution, which we might have in some things. But I want to make sure that I'm not jettisoning, a bunch of other kind of spiritual qualities which are necessary for a full human existence along the way.
Well, thank you so much. That's about all the time that we've got today for our interview, but we are going to get to talk more with Jason in Q&A. So please do put some questions in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And also you'll see that one way you can explore past writers is to order Jason Baxter's book from IVP, and Bob has put a link to do that in the chat. And IVP is offering a very good promotional of 40% off plus free shipping right now. So definitely take advantage of that and learn more about these authors that Jason has explored so deeply in this book. So we really hope that you get a chance to explore further in that way. And while we're waiting for some more Q&A to come into the chat, so please do put in your questions. I'll go ahead and ask you a kickoff to Q&A question, Jason, which I was hoping to get to anyway, so this works out well. You title your conclusion Nostalgia for the Future, and I really like that because I'm 100% for recovering the past, listening to the past, celebrating the past, but we can, as you kind of alluded to, sometimes just get stuck lamenting modern life, right? And just saying, oh, it would be better if we were in the 13th century.
Right.
And I think one thing I love about Lewis at his best is that he's looking to the past as a richer way to explore the present and the future. One great example you give in the book is he was very interested in quantum physics and emerging area of scholarly disciplines in his time. And he was finding in quantum physics a little bit of that sense of awe and mystery that you described so eloquently in the medieval cosmos. Obviously, the science is different, but there's a little bit of that sense. So what would you say to this gathering of emerging Christian scholars about how to love and celebrate the past, but be open to what God is doing now and hopeful about what he'll do in the future?
Yeah, what a cool question. I call it grumpy conservatism. And I know I have a tendency toward it. And I think it can be a real vice. It can be basically despair. And I think it's very interesting what I say, that nostalgia for the past was probably the chief sentiment of Lewis and his friends, the Inklings, throughout their lives. They repeatedly confessed to experiencing such nostalgia while reading ancient text. But this is the interesting part. But what they always insisted on was that the nostalgia they experienced was not just sentimentality for a past age. Rather, as Tolkien so enigmatically put it, it was a hunger for a remoteness even older than antiquity. A remoteness even older than antiquity. What an interesting thing to say if you just sort of meditate on that for a minute. A remoteness older than antiquity. I think this is also happening when you remember the strange scene in the Blue Room of that hideous strength during the seance, in which Venus comes and opens up the eternal ache in Merlin's heart. I think what they were all getting at is that there was a sense of fullness, a sense of holiness, which we both long for and which we will never entirely be satisfied with in this life. But there are sort of instruments, oftentimes from the past, precisely because they're remote from us, can prompt it. But if we think that the source of satisfaction were easily locatable in the past, then we're mistaken, because in some sense it's outside of the past, right? And well, it's God, it's his love, it's sort of participation in the community. And so there are, as you've said, at the very beginning of this very eloquently, Hannah, there are joy moments which erupt and give us what Augustine calls that sense of holy restlessness, right? In which I, for a brief moment, have the power to be discontent without being sinful, right? If that makes sense. But to have what Ralph Wood down in Texas calls a Christ-haunted self, right? But to think that, I think where sentimentality and nostalgia can become dangerous for us and lead to a kind of despair is when, and you think about this also in the last battle, right? The prince is tempted by this kind of despair precisely because he didn't live in the age of heroes, right? Is when we locate those things as in the past, such that if we could just get in a time machine, we could go back to it and then we would be happy. Well, the reality is we wouldn't, because it's not the thing itself. We're looking for something which is more remote, older, quote unquote, older than antiquity. And so in order to try to capture this kind of cool idea, in other words, in order to try to use a Christian theological term to describe it, which has become sort of flattened out and dead. Remember, Lewis called it committing verbicide, killing perfectly good words. Maybe right up there with awesome and awful is hope, right? I hope I get to go to the water park tomorrow, right? I hope I have ice cream this evening, right? For us, hope just means I would wish that it were. Whereas for our ancestors, hope has something more positive. It's what I call, half jokingly, nostalgia for the future. It's my ability to relocate my expectations, my nostalgia, my sentimentality, and to flip it from the past toward the future, toward this sort of land of fullness. And then interesting things, I think, start happening. Rather than feeling despair and feeling like, we're as, Christians or as spiritual beings, as lovers of beauty, as lovers of the word, we're out of place in modernity. We realize, well, of course we're out of place, because the fullness is now projected into the future. In other words, hope for a sense of fullness, nostalgia for the future. And I think that's what sometimes Tolkien and Lewis's critics don't get, right? There's been some nasty, you guys have probably seen them, but some nasty biographies on Lewis recently, saying that he was just he was a pathetic old man who was out of step with his generation. I think they're missing the point, right? It's not that they were nostalgic or sentimental. It's that they saw the past as instruments for awakening this hunger for something which is older than antiquity. That's what I mean by nostalgia for the future.
Thank you so much. What a rich answer. So I see we do have a comment in the chat here. Bob says, Till We Have Faces was one of Lewis's favorite works, but one many readers struggle with, including a group of faculty that Bob has read it with. And he says, besides the myth on which it is based, what sources might help readers better understand this book?
Wow, what a fun question. Thanks for that great question, Bob. So it's based on this myth by Apuleius, right, in Cupid and Psyche. And it's in the Apuleius's really weird book called The Metamorphoses, or also known as The Golden Ass. And it is a strange book. It will convince you that postmodern writers don't have anything on late antique writers. But the highlight of the book is this extraordinary tale of Cupid and Psyche, right? Of a young woman, Psyche, also meaning soul, right, in Greek, who's betrothed to an invisible but allegedly beautiful husband. And the only request is that just don't try to see my visibility, don't try to make me visible yet. She has a perfectly happy life, but of course she she cheats, right? She smuggles in the lamp, and she sets off this whole sort of chain reaction in which she almost loses the object of the beloved. Isn't that incredible? I mean, this is written in the 3rd century AD by a non-Christian pagan, but clearly about this idea of the soul and its impatience in trying to make that which object it supremely loves perfectly visible and accessible to it in every possible way. So I think Bob's right to read that is good. But Apuleius was, surprise, surprise, a great fan of Plato. So I think some of the dialogues of Plato, in which maybe especially something like the Symposium, in which Plato describes this type of ladder of love, and the sort of climbing up to the highest level of being, of divine love, it would be good background reading. But I argue in my book that I think maybe the best thing to do, especially to understand that very strange, I think for us in the sort of hashtag Me Too generation, right? This image of Orual having her veil pulled off, and then indeed even having her clothing removed, and being made to stand up in this sort of moment of public humiliation is really intimate and sort of bothersome. But I think what's going on is that Lewis is borrowing from this incredible scene in Dante's Purgatorio, where Dante is made to make this sort of deep confession, in which he has to own his own freedom, his own responsibility. He has to unveil himself, and that he has to confess this, not just that he has done these individual sins, but his sort of root sin, his sort of root waywardness. And there's an amazing moment which Dante says, it felt to me to have to make this confession, this deep confession. I think it would have been easier for a wind to blow over an aged oak tree and to pull it out by its roots than it was to get this confession out of me. So I think in some sense that kind of like Dante almost sort of imagined himself as going back in the position of Adam and kind of reaching down into the human heart, and not just sort of, when you're gardening and you're trying to get like one of those nasty weeds by the roots and you accidentally just keep pulling off the leaves and that does no good whatsoever. Like, well, sorry about that, to sort of get in there. But these roots are deep. These are like one of those sort of tape, root kind of, weeds. To get all the way down there, I think is what's happening in this incredible moment of Dante. And I think Lewis sort of figures this moment of what I call a spiritual nudity, in which I just have to let myself be seen. I have to stop faking. I have to stop presenting this image of myself, sort of controlling how people view me. I just have to let myself be seen. And for Orual, that's like this incredible moment of just letting herself be loved, right? As she is, warts and all, imperfections and all. And so I think in some sense, Lewis is very modern in this and very powerful, but sort of touches a sore spot in us, right? That weirdly for us to just simply let ourselves be loved in our imperfection is an incredibly difficult thing. Well, George Herbert himself says it at the end of one of his poems, right? Says, then I will serve. To which the Lord replies, no, you must sit down and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So I think Lewis in a very kind of, spiritually violent way, quote unquote, and that is very graphic, it's very moving, and you can't avoid feeling about it strongly, manages to touch, I think, on some real sore spots of modernity, of this fear of just letting myself be seen, being seen and being loved. And anyway, I've argued in the book that understanding this neat piece of Dante from the end of Purgatorio helps us appreciate some of the kind of spiritual therapeutic work that Lewis is trying to do on himself, but on his readers as well.
Well, thank you for unpacking some of that for us. And what an apt quotation of Herbert's Love 3, one of my own favorite poems. I see Karen says, this is such a rich conversation. Thank you. Sorry, I must leave now. Thanks for joining us. It was good to see you. Yeah, any last brief questions for Jason? We'll let Jason give us sort of a wrap-up comment in a few minutes, but we have about 3 minutes if you have a short question or just want to say one of your favorite Lewis books in the chat and ask if there are any medieval connections or anything else you might want to express. Feel free to type it into the chat in these last few moments we have for Q&A. And I'm definitely keeping an eye there, so we'll swap to audience Q&A if we get any more right now. One, I think, brief question. So you write, I think, really intriguingly of how Dante also inspired the Great Divorce. I found that exploration really helpful and interesting. I'm curious if you think Screwtape Letters is also riffing on the Inferno a bit, or if you feel like it has other precedents that are less related to Dante.
That's a cool question. And I hadn't thought of it before, but I think you're right. And I think I can think of at least maybe two small ways. One, Screwtape Letters is hilariously bureaucratic. Right. I mean, it's clear that Screwtape would be very successful in sort of in somewhere in the federal government, right? That they're very sort of bureaucratic, and that's always felt to me kind of what hell is like. But it's kind of when bureaucracy is at its worst, right? The forms are more important than anything else, right? The structures, even if the structures aren't very good, sort of take precedent over lived realities. Inferno is kind of like that. especially as you get kind of into it and begin to meet some of these kind of these devils who have to go about their protocol, right, and put in work order forms, even though they have to wait 1,000 years for certain things to get fixed, right? It's maddeningly bureaucratic and kind of hilarious unless you're living in the middle of it, right? I think that might be one little funny thing that that Lewis picked up, but I think the brilliance though is that I argue that in Great Divorce, the big sort of reveal is that kind of weight of glory style, is that heaven is holier, sharper, brighter, hotter, bigger than you can conceive. And that's something that really bothered Lewis throughout his life, is that for most of us, if I say heaven, this sort of vague imagery that wafts through our brain is some clouds, maybe an angel, a lute, all dressed in clean white linen, right? Like who wants to go there, right? Lewis worried about that. Like no one wants to go there. It sounds really boring, right? It's like a toilet paper commercial, right? And so Lewis felt that he really needed authors like Dante to create a sort of imaginative space in which heaven is overwhelmingly large and bright and glorious. So I think, thinking of that, I think Screwtape might be doing the exact opposite of creating a world which is, I've already called it bureaucratic, but oppressively, claustrophobically small, in which there's very little oxygen in the atmosphere. And we're dealing with very small souls who in some sense are kind of like only methodology, only reason, and all these other kind of ample human impulses, the chivalric impulse to virtue or to beauty or to generosity or to communion, or even just simple loves talked about in the four loves, right? The simple loves in which he talks about the warm animal smell from the basket. I mean, he loved animals, right? Everyone knows the feeling of a puppy, right? And you just hug it and just hold it so close to you, right? Even that in a way is a small love, but it's an uplifting love. It pulls you up a little bit. None of those loves, even the small ones, exist in the world of Screwtape. And I think that might be something which captures one of the visionary characteristics of Dante's Inferno.
Oh, that's really intriguing. I'll have to think some more about that. Thank you for sharing that. Well, we have arrived at the point where we give you a brief chance to kind of sum up or give us a closing exhortation or whatever you want to do with this short last word. So please give us a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll do a few announcements and close for the day.
Yeah, I think I discovered in writing this book, of why I've loved Lewis since I was a teenager. I've always loved Lewis and I've always felt it, but I don't think I've been able to articulate why. And I think it was coming across his essay, Meditations on the Toolshed, and realizing what an important set of concepts this was. What he sometimes calls contemplation versus enjoyment, but what he very usefully in Meditations in the Toolshed calls looking at the beam of light as it sort of comes through the crack in the toolshed, and then orienting your eyes so that you look along the beam. And in some sense, what you see when you look along the beam is no longer the beam itself, but rather the sky, the source of light. And so I think in preparing this book, I think I discovered, oh, wow, that's what Lewis dedicated the whole of his life to, is rotating back and forth, looking at the beam, then looking along the beam. And he didn't think that he could say he knows something until he could both describe it at and describe it along. Describe it as what I've read as sort of like a whole-brained learner, where he can think sort of analytically, rationally, left brain, think creatively, imaginatively, sympathetically, right brained, but then switch back and forth. So he says, what is it? It has four components, but what does it feel like? And this is what it feels like. I think that's Lewis's talent, is that kind of whole-brained analytic side, but also right-brained creative side, which he creates an atmosphere in which the concept of value you're describing is breathable before going back to analysis and going back and forth. That for me, I think, was my big discovery. And that was really inspiring to me, just thinking about my own teaching, about my own writing, but as well as how I read, to not be a speed reader. One of my professors once said to me, Jason, it's not how many books you read, it's how many you remember, right? How biblical is that, right? Remember when Ezekiel is given the scroll and God says, eat it. and he has to eat the word. I think seeing that from Lewis, I think, has really kind of encouraged me to try to be a better reader, in some sense of not just looking at all the words in the correct order, but to try to absorb that sort of linguistic nutrients into my soul so that it shapes my imagination, shapes my memory, shapes my heart, shapes my inclinations.
Well, what a wonderful insight to have in writing, and what a rich place to conclude this conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason. And I'll hand the hosting back to Bob Truby, who will invite you to the next conversation. And as you see, he's also put the Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis link in the chat again, so you can easily order the book and get that 40% IVP discount. Bob, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Hannah. And we do want to invite you to pick up a copy of The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. I also had a chance to read the book and just found it wonderfully illuminating in terms of understanding. For example, even where the idea of Oyarsis came from in Out of the Silent Planet. Just a wonderful, delightful book. And you can purchase it at 40% off. And actually, University Press has a deal right now where you can not only purchase that book for 40% off, but anything else in their catalog, and receive free shipping if you use the discount code 40IVCF22 at the checkout. So I don't know where you can get a better deal than that. We do want to let you know about our next conversation in July, July 18th. Scott Sundquist, who's the president at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which just recently announced a move into the Boston area from its suburban campus, is going to be talking about a new book that he is is coming out at the end of this month, called The Shape of Christian History. And he explores how thoughtful Christians, and especially historians and missiologists, make sense of global Christianity as an unfolding historical movement. For many of us, we wrestle with what has happened between the Acts of the Apostles and our present day. And reading church history gives us a sense of the stream that we're in and the wonderful ways that God has worked through history in the expansion of the church and the impact of the gospel in many cultures. And Scott will be talking with us some about that. Well, to conclude, I want to say, first of all, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be part of the conversation. We want to thank Jason, our guest, for taking time to talk about his book and join all of us in geeking out on C.S. Lewis. Thank you, Hannah, for interviewing and for just your thoughtful questions. We also do want to acknowledge University Press, who works with us in hosting these conversations. They're just wonderful partners, and we hope you will give them some of your book trade. Last of all, we want to tell you that these conversations are sponsored by the Emerging Scholars Network. We would invite you, if you're not already a member of the Emerging Scholars Network, that you can join for free at our website, blog.emergingscholars.org. Just click that little join button. There's a short form to fill out, and that will connect you to our newsletter and to all the different kind of programming and resources that Emerging Scholars Network seeks to offer scholars on their academic journey. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESNIVCF. Also, this and about 30 other conversations are available on our YouTube channel. You just go to youtube.com/ESNIVCF, and you can, in a day or so, this conversation will be up, as well as a number of our previous conversations over the last 2 years. So with that, we're going to conclude our recording, and you're welcome to stay on and chat for a few more minutes with Jason. But thanks again for joining us.